I am live. I'm reading out of Eyes of Horus. It is a book by Joan Marshall Grants, a far memory book. She used to remember her previous incarnations, and she's written 7 books. She passed away in 1989, and I am reading here now in part 6. We just had a battle, a ferocious battle between 2 priests fighting for good and evil, and the good won, but it was a very exciting trial by magic, it was called. We're now in part 6, chapter 5, Tomb of SEKMET. I should always remember that scene in the courtyard of the temple of SEKMET, as though the time in which it was being enacted had the quality of dream time, and was not concerned with the arbitrary divisions of hours, for I was able to observe things simultaneously, as though they were in a sequence spaced sufficiently far apart for me to give them undivided attention. Heket, no longer the medium of dark powers, but only a man, old and brutish, beaten to the ground by the hawk of Horus, his screams dying down to a shrill whimpering as he crawled on his belly towards the sanctuary of the goddess who had been powerless to protect him. A few of the acolytes still swung their censers to and fro, but the ordered line of priests had broken. They were huddled together, staring in horror at he for who so long had held them under his domination. I gave an exultant shout which echoed along our ranks. Horus has triumphed in the name of Ra. The oryx has put the servants of Set to flight. Great is the power of Ra in whose name we live. Honor to the champions of the oryx. With wild enthusiasm they acclaimed Kepha, who, except for extreme exhaustion, showed no sign of his terrible ordeal. It was not until late in the evening that he showed me the scarlet furrows where the fangs of the serpent of Apep had been powerful enough to score not only the Ka, but the Kat, the physical body, as well its life-bearing counterpart. The soldiers of the reed had kept their ranks, and I went forward and spoke to them. Men of the reed, you have seen how Ra has conquered SEKMET, and the light triumphed over darkness. It is not you whom we of the south are fighting against. We fight against fear, the secondary title of the goddess whose servant Heket we have overthrown. Our enemies are those men who desire to leave authority in the hands of fear, who desire that the child shall flinch from the father, and the women from the men. The village cringe before its headman, and the headman quails at a word from the overseer. If you wish men to work only because they are driven by whipman, and the granaries to be empty because Pharaoh fears his powers will grow less if his gold is bartered with the Asiatics. If you wish hatred, the harlot, to be the most honored of your women, and truth to find no lodging in your homes, if you wish to live as blind men plodding in shackles, if this be what you wish for Egypt and yourselves, then continue your fight against us. Try to make Menhet your pharaoh, so that SEKMET may rule. To your captain I have given my word that even in defeat you still have a choice to make. Let the reed join with the oryx and the south, to live in peace while Amemembet rules, and fear and sorrow go down into the tomb of a dead pharaoh. Or take the second choice for 40 days, sworn by the warrior's code, to raise no hand against us or our cause. If there are those among you who will join us, come forward as a sign that you know Amemembet to be the rightful ruler of the 2 lands. The captain of the reed came forward and put his hands on my shoulders. the greeting given between brothers. "My men must judge for themselves," he said, "but henceforward the captain of the reed is under your command." Rank after rank his men surged forward, cheering, and as they came, the reed and the oryx, for Amemet and the south. I had posted a strong guard at both the other entrances to the temple, so that I knew that none of the SEKMET servants could have made their escape. Tethem had told me that in the SEKMET temple of the royal city there were underground rooms to which only the high priests and those who worked in closest collaboration with him had access. If there were similar rooms here, I thought it advisable that the captain of the reed should accompany me in their discovery, and so be able to tell his soldiers, who, in their turn, would tell the townspeople, the value of the priesthood, who until today had held the old capital in subjection. The captain of the reed asked that the oryx and the jackal should be the guests of his soldiers in their barracks, and to this I agreed most willingly, for there can be no better way of bringing peace to a city than by a conqueror and conquered entering it side by side in friendship. I decided to keep with me only 100 mace bearers, and of these 20 accompanied me together with Hanuk, Kias, Pata'aru, and the captain of the reed, while to the rest I gave the task of destroying the statue of SEKMET, and was glad I had had the foresight to include in our equipment hammers and wedges suitably for such work. Immediately beyond the entrance, at the top of the steps, was the sanctuary from which the statue had been brought. Beside the plinth on which it usually stood were the rollers which had been used to move it, and I saw there were 3 other doors, one on each side, and a third opposite the main entrance. I opened the door in the south wall and found it led into a smaller sanctuary, which was lit by a small opening in the roof and lined with slabs of black granite. It contained a statue of Set in his human form, flanked by 2 smaller statues of the crocodiles, which guard the underworld. There was a partly consumed black kid still smouldering on the offering table, but apart from this the room showed no sign of recent use. In the sanctuary on the north side the statue of SEKMET was in the form of a cat. On the plinth was a bowl of milk and a basket of fish, though I didn't notice this until later, for what occupied the offering table held my whole attention. It was a girl, perhaps a little younger than Kias. Her body was being bent backwards, the shoulders and loins supported on the altar, her hair, a beautiful dark red, hanging to the floor. So grotesquely had her body been tied that it looked like a travesty of the position in which Nut is sometimes depicted as goddess of the sky. The girl's eyes were open as though she were watching death to come, to release her from the torments of the flesh. Her belly had been ripped open downwards from the navel, and between her legs had been set a bowl, not nearly full, to catch the blood as it drained down. She screamed only once, said Kias. That wound wouldn't have killed her instantly. She must have been in pain a long time. The girl's mouth was distorted, the jaw was not yet rigid, and it had fallen open. It looked more closely and saw that a wad of rags had been thrust down her throat. To Kias I said, "That is how they stopped her screaming." There was a sound of retching. One of the mace bearers had been sick outside the door. "May Ra blast the soul of the man who killed her," said Hanuk. Kias was breathing rapidly, and her hands were tightly clenched. Yet she managed to keep her voice controlled and dispassionate. Ra would, if the man had not done so himself. He has blasted his own soul, so why should the gods interfere when their laws are already in operation? The door at the back of the central sanctuary led into a gallery from which several rooms opened. The doors were sealed, but when they had been forced, we saw that in the first three the temple treasures were stored. On the wood shelves were a large quantity of valuables of many kinds: tusks of ivory, collars of gold and silver, women's ornaments varying from the most rare jewels of the wives of rich nobles down to a single carnelian bead on a leather tongue, perhaps the most cherished possession of a woman of the very poor. In another room were thousands of tallies, some on clay tablets, others on papyri, others on wooden panels, which recorded the particulars of all bribes offered to SEKMET by petitioners. I remembered the man who had paid his 3 bulls after a lapse of 7 years. He was right in saying that the priests of SEKMET were careful of their tallies. In another room were many small rolls of papyri, which when they were later examined proved to be the lists of discreditable activities of nobles, officials and merchants used as a threat to extort additional tribute. This information had come from many sources. Sometimes a household servant had been allowed to pay no temple tribute if instead he could reveal something, such as an appropriation of taxes due to Pharaoh that was punishable by death or torture. There were also many records of women who had been unfaithful to their husbands and who ever since had lived under the fear of exposure if they failed to fulfill the demands made on them by the priests. At the end of the gallery a door gave on to another running parallel to it. At one end was the entrance to the priest's courtyard, and at the other were the 2 rooms which had been occupied by the high priest. Rather to my surprise, these rooms were empty, so we went on to the courtyard, thinking Heket had hidden in one of the priest's houses. Houses and courtyard were equally deserted. I went to the gate and asked the guard if he had set them, I had set there if anyone had passed through. He was emphatic that no one had left the temple, either by the gates or over the wall, since we ourselves had entered before the ordeal. I'll finish this here and make a second part of this chapter. Have a good Friday the 13th.